Silence in the house.
My name is Tom, and I want to share a story I'll never forget. I was 12 when it happened. My parents had gone to visit some friends in a nearby town and told me they'd be back late. I was left home alone for the evening. We lived in a small, single-story house with big windows in the kitchen and living room. There was a small backyard, and the nearest neighbors lived across the street. My parents reminded me to lock the doors and assured me there was nothing to worry about. The evening started quietly. I made myself comfortable on the couch in the living room, watching TV and eating chips. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard a strange sound, a faint creak, like someone stepping cautiously on the wooden boards of our porch. I turned off the TV and froze. The living room fell silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat. After a minute, I convinced myself it was nothing. I went back to the couch and turned the movie back on. But a few minutes later, I heard another noise, a faint click. It was the sound of the doorknob being tested. My blood ran cold. I quietly moved to the hallway to check the front door. Someone was jiggling the handle. A white circle of light from a flashlight moved across the window beside the door. I saw a man's silhouette standing on the porch. He was muttering something under his breath, but I couldn't make out the words. My first thought was that my parents had returned, but I quickly realized this wasn't them. The man was trying to force the door open. I quickly turned off the lights in the living room and kitchen to avoid being seen. I hid behind the kitchen blinds, keeping an eye on him as he walked around the house, shining his flashlight into the windows. When the beam of light swept across me, I held my breath, praying he wouldn't notice. Luckily, he didn't and moved on. Then, I heard a loud thud at the back door. He was trying to kick it in. That's when I knew I had to act. I crawled to the kitchen table where my phone was and dialed 911. Speaking in a whisper, I told the operator that someone was trying to break into my house. Meanwhile, the man didn't stop. He began pounding on the glass of the back door. Cracks started forming with each hit. It felt like the door was moments away from shattering when a shout suddenly broke the tension. It was our neighbor, Mr. Harris. He had stepped out onto his porch with his own flashlight and yelled, "Hey, what do you think you're doing? Get out of here before the cops show up." The man froze for a second, then bolted across the yard and into the darkness. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of sirens. The police arrived quickly, and they found him hiding in some bushes a few blocks away. When my parents got home, I told them everything, though I was much calmer by then. The police said the man was a known burglar who targeted houses where no adults were around. That night, I learned that fear is natural, but the key is to stay calm and act. I also learned how important it is to have neighbors who've got your back.
The neighbor behind the fence. It happened a few years ago when I was 16. My parents and I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other. But that man, he was different. His name was Mr. Grayson. He lived across the street in an old, slightly run-down house. His yard was always shadowed by tall trees, and even on the brightest days it looked gloomy. Grayson barely spoke to anyone. Sometimes I'd see him sitting on his porch, motionless, staring straight ahead. His gaze was always heavy and piercing. One evening, as I was walking home after hanging out with friends, I noticed something strange. A dim red light was glowing from one of his windows. At first, I thought it was just a lamp, but then I noticed a shadow moving within the glow. I hurried into my house, not wanting to know more. The next few days seemed normal, but one night stood out. I was lying in my room playing on my phone when I suddenly heard a noise near the window. It was faint, like the creak of a fence. I peeked through a gap in the curtains and saw Mr. Grayson leaving his house. He was wearing a black jacket and carrying a large black bag. I watched as he walked to his car, opened the trunk, and threw the bag inside. His movements were quick, as if he didn't want anyone to see him. My heart started pounding. It felt like a scene from a horror movie, except it was real. The next day, I noticed something even more unusual. Late at night, someone was digging in Grayson's yard, but it wasn't him. I saw the figure of another man I'd never seen before. That was too much. I tried telling my parents about it, but they brushed it off, saying I was imagining things. So, I decided to act on my own. The following evening, I grabbed my binoculars and started watching Grayson's house. I saw him open his garage door and go inside. A few minutes later, I heard noises coming from the garage, metallic banging sounds. I couldn't take it anymore and called the police. I told them everything I'd seen. They said they would send a patrol. The police arrived 20 minutes later, but it was already too late. Grayson had fled. They found evidence in his house that confirmed the worst. He was a serial killer. In the basement, they discovered a room with soundproofed walls and several bags resembling the one I had seen that night. They searched for him for months, but never found him. Since then, I've made it a habit to lock all the doors and windows, even during the day. And while I'm proud, I helped expose him. Sometimes at night, I feel like I see a shadow behind my fence. In those moments, I can't sleep, thinking that Grayson might still be out there, somewhere close.
The unexpected truth about my ex.
My name is Alice, and this happened 2 years ago when I was 19. I've hesitated to share this story for a long time, but now I feel it's important to tell it to warn others. I dated Luke for almost a year. At first, he seemed perfect. Attentive, caring, and always there when I needed him. But over time, his behavior began to change. He became increasingly jealous, constantly checking my phone and asking strange questions about where I'd been and with whom. I convinced myself it was just because he cared, but eventually it became unbearable. I decided to break up with him. The conversation was tough. At first, Luke begged me to stay. Then he started blaming me for everything. I didn't expect such an emotional outburst, but in the end, he seemed to accept it. At least, that's what I thought. A few weeks after the breakup, I started feeling like someone was watching me. When I walked home from work, I often thought I saw Luke following me, but every time I turned around, no one was there. I chalked it up to my imagination. After all, the breakup had been difficult, and my nerves were on edge. One night, everything changed. It was an ordinary evening. I was home alone, watching a show and trying to relax after a long day. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard a faint knock on the front door. Surprised, I looked through the peephole but didn't see anyone. I assumed it was just a prank by a neighbor and went back to the couch. A few minutes later, I heard a noise coming from the backyard. Someone was moving near the windows. My heart started racing. I turned off the lights in the room and peeked through the curtains. Standing there was Luke, holding a knife, examining it under the glow of a flashlight. My breath quickened. I quietly stepped away from the window and grabbed my phone. I called 911, whispering the situation to the operator. They told me to stay on the line and find a safe place to hide. I hid in the closet in my bedroom, clutching my phone tightly, trying not to make a sound. Meanwhile, Luke began banging on the front door. He was yelling about how I'd ruined his life and how I had to pay for it. Then I heard him trying to kick the door in. The loud cracking sound echoed through the quiet house. All I could do was wait. The police assured me they were on their way. When the door finally gave way, Luke entered the house. I could hear his heavy footsteps. He was searching for me, calling my name, blaming me for everything. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. Then, unexpectedly, the sound of police sirens broke the silence. Luke tried to escape through the backyard, but the officers had already surrounded the house. They caught him before he could get away. Later, I found out that Luke had been planning this night for some time. The police found notes on his phone detailing exactly what he wanted to do to me. Every detail had been meticulously thought out. Since then, I've become much more cautious. I've changed the locks, installed cameras, and never leave the doors unlocked, even during the day. This experience taught me that sometimes, even when you think something is over, it's just the beginning. And if you ever feel like something isn't right, trust your instincts. It might just save your life.